a starving woman, a silent man, and a deal so cold it should have stayed that way. When Bram Ashcroft pulled Aliska Novak out of the dirt of a dying mining camp, he wasn't saving her. He was buying labor. 6 months. 1 winter. Survive and get paid. Simple. But nothing about that mountain was simple, and nothing about what happened inside that cabin was supposed to happen at all. If this story finds you tonight, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. Hit like, and let's begin. The mining camp of Harrow Gulch didn't smell like opportunity. It smelled like wet ash, animal waste, cheap whiskey, and the particular kind of human desperation that soaks into wood and never quite leaves. It sat wedged between 2 granite ridges in the northern Rockies like something the mountains had coughed up and forgotten about. A loose collection of canvas tents, split timber saloons, and mud-packed shacks that leaned against each other the way drunks do, each one depending on the next not to fall. Bram Ashcroft rode into it on a gray Tuesday in late October, and he hated it immediately. He always hated it. Every year, same feeling. The noise alone was enough. Men shouting over card games, mules braying at nothing, some poor fool hammering a tin roof in the kind of cold that made metal ring like a cracked bell. Bram was not a man built for noise. He was built for silence, for the long white quiet of the high country, where the only sounds were wind and wood and the occasional distant report of his own rifle. He was 41 years old, lean as stripped bark, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and eyes the color of old creek ice, pale, flat, and difficult to read. He came down from the mountain once a year, sometimes twice if something broke that he couldn't fix himself. He bought what he needed: salt, flour, powder, a few specific tools, occasionally medicine. He talked to no one he didn't have to. He slept one night in the cheapest room the boarding house offered and left before sunrise. This year was different. This year the winter had come early, 2 full weeks before it should have, and it had come hard. He'd watched the first storms build from his porch and knew, with the calm certainty of a man who had read weather for 2 decades, that what was coming would be worse than anything he'd seen in a long stretch. His cabin would need tending. His trap lines ran long, and his supply runs would push into dangerous territory. Alone, he could manage. He always had. But alone, there was no margin. 1 bad fall, 1 infected cut, 1 week of sickness, and the cabin could go dark. He needed help. The word felt foreign in his mouth, even as a thought. He'd asked around before leaving the high country, quietly, without making it a thing, whether any of the seasonal workers passing through the lower camps were looking for winter employment. Shelter and food in exchange for labor. Nothing complicated. He didn't need a hunting partner or a conversationalist. He needed someone who could haul wood, tend a stove, cook a meal, and not fall to pieces when the thermometer dropped below 0 for 2 weeks running. He'd heard there might be someone in Harrow Gulch, an immigrant woman, recently stranded, working whatever scraps of work the camp offered. His source, a half-deaf supply runner named Cord, who came through the mountain pass every few weeks, had described her as quiet and capable. That was enough for Bram to make the trip. He tied his horse at the rail outside the general store and went in to collect his supplies before anything else. Business first. Always. The store was run by a man named Dolan, who was shaped like a barrel and talked like he was being paid by the word. Bram suffered through the transaction with the patience of someone who had long since stopped expecting conversations to be short, nodded at the appropriate moments, confirmed his order, and arranged to pick up the loaded packs the following morning. Then he stepped back out into the cold. That was when he heard it. Not the shout. He'd heard 100 fights since arriving. What made him turn was the silence that followed the shout. A sudden, absolute quiet in a corner of the camp where there'd been noise a moment before. The kind of quiet that meant something had gone wrong faster than anyone expected. He found the source around the side of the nearest saloon. A large man, minor by the look of him, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that spent their days swinging a pick, was sitting in the mud with a deeply confused expression on his face. Blood ran freely from his nose. Beside him lay a soaking wet wool shirt, the kind that had clearly just been wrung out after washing, twisted and heavy with water. And standing perhaps 4 feet away, completely still, was a woman. She was wiping her hands on her apron. That was the thing that caught Bram's attention more than anything else. Not the man bleeding in the mud, Not the small crowd that had gathered and then quickly lost interest once the entertainment was clearly over. It was the way she dried her hands, methodical, unhurried, like she'd just finished a task and was preparing for the next one. No shaking, no tears, no theatrical display of either triumph or distress. She was thin in the way that people get thin when they've been working hard and eating little for a long time. Her hair was dark and pulled back severely, more for function than any other reason. Her coat was patched in at least 3 places. Her boots had seen better years, but her posture was straight, and her expression, when she glanced briefly at the man in the mud and then away, was simply tired. Not frightened, not angry, just tired. Bram looked at the man on the ground. He was already trying to get up, more embarrassed than injured, muttering something about the woman being crazy. 2 of his friends had materialized to help him, and the 3 of them stumbled away without making further trouble. Apparently, whatever the man had tried had not been worth repeating. The woman went back to her washboard without a word. Bram stood there a moment, which was unusual for him. He was not a standing around type. Then he walked over. "You Aliska Novak?" he said. She didn't look up right away. She continued working the cloth against the board, her knuckles red from cold water, and then she did look up, directly at him, which most people didn't do on first meeting. He had a face that tended to discourage direct eye contact. "Who's asking?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. Her English was careful, slightly accented, each word placed deliberately, the way people speak when they learn the language from instruction rather than infancy. "Name's Ashcroft. I was told you might be looking for work." She looked at him for a moment without answering. Then she looked at the man still retreating across the camp, then back at Bram. "What kind of work?" she said. "Mountain work. I run a trap line in a homestead about 12 miles above the snow line. Winter's setting in early this year, and I need someone to keep the place running while I'm on the line. Cooking, hauling wood, tending the stove, keeping the supply stores in order. Hard work. Long days. Pay? Fair wage held until spring, plus full room and board for the duration." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at his hands, which was an odd thing to look at, but maybe she was evaluating what kind of man he was by the state of his hands. They were scarred and calloused, and missing the tip of one finger from a trapping accident years ago. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy some internal calculation. "How far is 12 miles above the snow line?" she said. "Meaning you won't be walking back down until April at the earliest, maybe May. No visitors. None. No one from town coming through. Nobody comes up that far in winter. That's the point." She wrung out the shirt she'd been washing, the same one she'd just used to put a large man on the ground, and draped it over the line without ceremony. "Why me?" she said. It was a fair question, and she seemed to know it. Bram considered lying or giving some diplomatic version of the truth. He decided against it. "You're capable," he said. "I watched you handle a problem without losing your head and without needing anyone's help. That's not as common as it should be. I'm not looking for someone who needs looking after. I already have enough to look after." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, more like the recognition of something she hadn't expected to encounter. "When do we leave?" she said. "Tomorrow, before first light." She nodded once and went back to her laundry. That was the entire negotiation. Later, over a meal he ate alone in the boarding house dining room, Bram tried to think through what he'd just done and whether it was a mistake. He'd made decisions based on less. He'd hired men before for seasonal work with no more scrutiny than he'd just applied to this woman, and those situations had always resolved themselves one way or another. People either worked or they didn't. The mountain had a way of making clear very quickly which category a person fell into. Still, a woman. Alone in his cabin for 6 months. He wasn't concerned about impropriety. He was 41 years old and had long since filed away anything resembling romantic interest as a complication he didn't have room for. What concerned him was more practical. What if she couldn't manage the physicality of it? The wood didn't haul itself. The stove needed feeding at 3 in the morning when the temperature dropped. Frontier cooking wasn't the same as kitchen cooking. It required problem-solving and improvisation and a tolerance for results that didn't always look like the original intention. He turned the question over and set it down. She'd put a man twice her size in the mud with a wet shirt. She'd be fine. They met at the edge of camp before dawn, their breath coming out in small white clouds. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the mud had hardened into ridged furrows that caught the faint gray light. Bram had his pack horse loaded. He'd said she could bring one bag. She had one bag, a canvas sack that didn't look heavy. "I should tell you," she said, as they started up the first switchback, her horse following his without complaint. "I've never been in mountains like this." "I know," he said. "Then why?" "Because mountains aren't the problem. People are the problem. Mountains just ask whether you're serious or not. You're serious. The rest you'll learn." She was quiet for a moment. The trail narrowed and they rode single file. "That's either very wise or very stupid," she said. "I've been told both." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. That was the first thing Bram noticed. Most people could not tolerate silence. They filled it compulsively, with observations or questions or half-formed stories that led nowhere. Eliska rode behind him for 2 solid hours without making a sound, and the absence of noise felt, to Bram, like the first decent thing that had happened in a while. The trail climbed steadily. By mid-morning, they were above the tree line and into the kind of cold that was different from the cold below. Cleaner, sharper, with a bite that came at you from all directions. The wind moved through the rock faces and made sounds that visitors sometimes found unsettling. Eliska showed no sign of finding them unsettling. She kept her eyes moving across the terrain the way a careful person does when they don't know the country. Not with fear, but with attention. "That ridge," she said at one point, pointing east. "Is that the line we stay below?" "On the way up, yes. There's a pass another half-mile ahead that cuts through. Once we're through the pass, the cabin is another 3 miles north." "I can't see it." "You won't until you're 50 yards from it. It sits in a fold in the terrain. Took me 2 seasons to find the right placement. Windbreaks on 3 sides." "You built it yourself?" "Most of it. Hired out the heavier log work the first year. Everything since has been mine." She absorbed this without comment, which he appreciated. Some people responded to that kind of information with excessive admiration, or worse, with the particular pity of someone who found solitude inherently sad. She did neither. She just cataloged it. They reached the cabin just as the light was beginning to go. It was not a romantic structure, it was a working structure. Low-roofed, chinked with dried clay and moss, a narrow porch that served more as a wind buffer than any decorative purpose, a woodshed attached to the left side, nearly full, a small outbuilding 20 yards east that served as the smokehouse and cold storage. The cabin door was heavy and double-latched. The windows were small and shuttered. Eliska stopped her horse and looked at it. Bram waited. "It's solid," she said after a moment. "Built to last, not to impress," he said. "Good," she said. "Impressive things fall apart in bad weather." He wasn't sure she meant it as a comment on anything beyond the architecture. He unloaded the horses and showed her inside. The interior was roughly 12 by 16 feet, which was more generous than it looked from outside. A stone fireplace on the north wall that also served as the cooking hearth, a cast-iron stove for secondary heat and additional cooking when needed, a workbench along the east wall, 2 separate sleeping areas divided by a hanging canvas partition, basic but sufficient, shelves of supplies organized with a precision that surprised her, she could tell, by the way her eyes moved across them. "The partition goes both ways," Bram said without particular emphasis. "I don't go through it unless there's an emergency, and I announce myself first. Same applies to you. Are we clear on that?" "Clear," she said. "Good. The stove needs feeding at 3-hour intervals minimum to keep the temperature livable on bad nights. There's a log beside the stove that marks the supply schedule. I'll go through it with you in the morning. Tonight we eat whatever's simple and get some sleep. We start work at first light." He cooked that first night because she didn't yet know where anything was. Salt pork and dried beans, with hardtack on the side and strong coffee. It wasn't a meal designed to be enjoyed. It was designed to be consumed. Eliska ate everything on her plate without comment and washed her own dishes before he had a chance to. "Where does the water come in?" she asked, looking at the covered barrel near the stove. "Spring melt catchment behind the cabin. Drains to that barrel through a pipe I laid 3 years ago. Runs most of the winter unless we get a sustained deep freeze. If the pipe freezes, we melt snow." "How often does the pipe freeze?" 3 times in 8 years. Maybe once this winter, with the cold coming early." She nodded, filing it away. He showed her the firewood stack, the kindling box, The spare flint and steel in the tin on the shelf, the medical kit on the top shelf, contents and usage, briefly but clearly, and then the rifle mounted on the wall above the door. "Can you shoot?" he asked. "No," she said. "We'll deal with that later," he said. She didn't ask why later. She just said, "All right." The first week was an education in displacement. Aliska had been competent at most things she'd tried in her life. That was the difficulty. Competence built in one environment doesn't automatically transfer to another, and the mountain operated by its own rules, and those rules did not forgive assumption. She burned the first 2 batches of biscuits because the stove ran hotter than any kitchen range she'd ever used. She underestimated the weight of a full water barrel and nearly dropped it on her foot. She spent an entire morning reorganizing the supply shelves before Bram quietly pointed out that his organizational system, while not immediately obvious, was specifically designed around what he needed to access fastest in poor visibility and low light. She apologized once. He waved it off. "You're learning," he said. "That's different from being careless." She restructured the shelves along his logic and didn't make that particular mistake again. By the second week, she had the stove schedule memorized and executed it without prompting, including the 3 a.m. feeding that most people, she suspected, would have slept through. She'd reworked Bram's cooking routine to yield more meals from the same supplies, not because he asked her to, but because she'd looked at the inventory and done the arithmetic and found room to improve the ratios. When he came in from the trap line one evening and found the evening meal was twice what he was used to, he looked at her. "Same supplies," she said, "better planning." He sat down and ate and said nothing, but she noticed he ate more than usual. They developed a rhythm, the way people do when they have to. It wasn't friendship exactly. It was something more functional than friendship, a mutual orientation around the work, a set of unspoken agreements about space and noise and expectation. Bram didn't explain himself and didn't expect explanation. Aliska didn't offer conversation for its own sake and didn't require it. When they did talk, it was usually about the immediate practical reality, weather coming in from the northwest, the state of the trap line's easternmost section, whether the smokehouse temperature needed adjusting. But sometimes, on the worst nights, when the wind threw itself against the cabin walls hard enough to make the shutters rattle and the fire worked twice as hard to hold the cold at bay, they talked about other things. Not much. Not in depth. But it happened. She told him one such night in late November that she had come from a small city in Central Europe, that her family had saved for 4 years to buy her passage, that she'd arrived in New York with a specific plan and a specific contact, and that the plan had collapsed within 2 weeks of landing when the contact, a distant cousin, died of a fever before she arrived. Everything after that had been improvisation. "Harrow Gulch was the end of the improvisation?" he asked. "Almost," she said. "I had maybe 2 more weeks before I couldn't afford to eat, and the options were getting narrower." She said it without self-pity, with the flat matter-of-factness of someone describing a logistical problem that had been mostly resolved. "What would you have done," he said, "if I hadn't shown up?" She looked at the fire for a moment. "Kept going," she said, "in some direction. There wasn't really another option worth thinking about." He nodded slowly. He understood this philosophy without needing it explained. He had lived by a version of it for most of his adult life. Not optimism exactly, but a refusal to allow the absence of good options to constitute permission to stop. He didn't say this out loud, but something in his posture changed slightly, and she may or may not have noticed. Well, December arrived with a cruelty that felt almost personal. 2 storms in 4 days, each one worse than the last. The second building on the debris of the first and driving snow so fine and hard, it found its way through gaps no one had noticed existed. Bram spent 3 hours one morning repacking the chinking around the north window with moss and clay, working in gloves with fingers that could barely feel the material. Aliska held the tarp that blocked the wind while he worked, not because he asked her to, but because she'd seen the problem and solved the supporting role before he'd finished formulating the request. When they came inside afterward, both of them half frozen, she made coffee and didn't comment on the fact that his hands shook slightly while he wrapped them around the cup. He didn't comment on the fact that she'd lost feeling in her left ear and was pressing it against the warm side of the coffee mug to bring it back. Small dignities. The mountain life was built on them. By mid-December, the cabin had settled into its full winter character, which meant it was, depending on the hour, either brutally functional or quietly warm, with very little in between. On clear nights, the cold outside dropped to territories that would have seemed abstract to most people. Inside, the stove and fireplace working together kept the temperature inhabitable, and the smell of wood smoke and dried herbs, and occasionally something cooking filled the space in a way that was, against all reasonable expectation, sometimes almost comfortable. Bram was gone for long stretches. The trapline was extensive. He'd built it over 8 years of careful expansion, and servicing it required full-day efforts, sometimes overnight stays at the rudimentary shelter he'd built at the line's far end. When he was gone, Eliska ran the cabin with a precision that would have surprised anyone who hadn't seen her work. The stove didn't drop. The wood supply didn't deplete carelessly. The meals were ready at the right hours, even when there was no one to eat them yet. She'd taken to walking a short perimeter around the cabin each morning, learning the terrain close in, where the ground dropped unexpectedly, where the wind created ice sheets by dawn, where visibility fell away into nothing if the cloud cover was low. She wasn't sure why she did this. Something in her, maybe the same instinct that had kept her alive through 2 years of difficult improvisation, told her that knowing the ground underfoot was not optional. That instinct saved her life in early January, or rather, it didn't save her life, because her life wasn't the thing in danger, but it saved something else. She was hauling ice from the natural formation that had built up against the east wall, using it to supplement the water supply since the pipe had, as predicted, frozen 3 days earlier, when she heard the sound. Not the wind, not settling timber, something with intention behind it. She stopped moving. The sound came again, low, erratic, with the kind of hunger in it that changed the quality of silence around it. She set down the ice block very slowly and looked toward the woodshed. The coyote was large for its breed, underfed, which made it either cautious or reckless, and she couldn't immediately tell which. It had come around the far corner of the woodshed and was standing between her and the cabin door, maybe 15 feet away, looking at the same thing she was looking at, the wrapped pack of cured meat she'd left on the porch step while she gathered ice. 15 feet, door behind the coyote, ice block in her hands, nothing else within reach. The coyote looked at the meat. Then it looked at her. Its assessment of the two obstacles was visible and brief. It moved for the meat. Eliska moved at the same moment. She came in from the side, not from behind, because coming from behind a panicked predator that was small enough to be quick was a way to lose a chunk of your leg. She came in from the side and brought the ice block down hard on the animal's hindquarters, not its skull. She didn't have the angle. And when it turned and snapped at her, she stepped back once and then stepped in again with the block swinging like a club. The second blow connected with its shoulder and knocked it sideways into the snow. It scrambled. It ran. She let it go. She stood there for a moment, ice block still in her hands, breathing hard through her nose, watching the empty space where the coyote had been. Then she looked at the meat on the porch. Still there. She picked it up, went inside, and latched the door behind her. Her hands were shaking. That was the first time she let herself shake, since the mining camp. She stood at the kitchen shelf with her back to the room and let her hands tremble for about 30 seconds until they stopped, and then she put the kettle on and went back to work. Bram returned that evening after dark, stamping snow from his boots in the porch, and noticed the disturbed snow on the east side of the cabin immediately. "What happened out there?" he said, coming through the door. "Coyote," she said from the stove. "Came for the meat. I discouraged it." He looked at her. Then he looked at the ice block sitting near the door, which had a smear of fur and blood on one edge. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." "It didn't." "I said no," she said. Her voice was even. "Supper's ready." He sat down. He ate. He looked at the ice block twice more during the meal, doing the reconstruction in his mind, working out the geometry of what she'd had to do with what was available. "Good thinking," he said eventually, coming from the side. "It seemed like the only angle that didn't end with me losing something." "That's correct," he said. He ate another spoonful. "Tomorrow I'll show you where I keep the spare axe handle. It mounts under the porch railing within reach of the door. Faster to get to if you're coming out from inside." She looked at him. "You should have shown me that before," she said. "You're right," he said. "I should have." He said it without defensiveness. No justification, no caveat, just acknowledgement. She had expected something else. Some version of, "I didn't think you'd need it," or "I didn't expect this kind of trouble." She had been prepared even to argue the point. Instead, she just said, "All right." What? The infection came in February, which Bram would later describe to himself as bad timing, as if there were a good month for a trapping accident to nearly kill you. He'd caught the edge of a trap release wrong, a moment of inattention on a morning when the cold was distracting and his mind was on a weather system building to the west, and the steel jaw had taken a chunk out of the meat of his left forearm rather than closing on empty air. It wasn't deep. He'd packed the wound himself, laced it tight, and finished the line service before coming in, because the alternative was leaving the traps unserviced in incoming weather. He didn't tell Eliska how it happened. She found out anyway, 4 days later, when the fever broke his discretion and she came to his side of the partition in the early morning hours because she'd heard him moving strangely, not with the deliberate quiet of a man up for a routine reason, but with the uncoordinated, slow heaviness of someone not entirely present. She found him sitting on the edge of his bunk, trying to relace his boot and unable to make his fingers work properly. She looked at him. She looked at his arm, which was wrapped but visibly swollen even through the cloth. "How long?" she said. 2 days of proper fever. Maybe 3 if you count the start." His voice was rougher than usual, lower. "Show me the wound." "It's fine." "Bram." Her voice was level. "Show me the wound." He looked at her for a moment, the look of a man weighing whether to argue the point, and then he unwrapped the lace and began working the cloth loose from his arm. What she saw was not fine. She'd seen infections before. Working in the mines, living in camps. She'd seen what happened when wounds weren't cleaned right or weren't cleaned in time. When men worked through the early signs because stopping wasn't an option, and then stopped permanently because they'd waited too long. This was early enough. She believed it was early enough. "Sit back," she said. "I can manage?" "You cannot manage," she said, with a patience that had iron underneath it. "You're running a fever and your arm is infected, and I need you to sit back and let me work. Can you do that? Or do I need to argue with you while your arm gets worse?" Silence. Then he sat back. "There's a medical kit on the top shelf, I know. Sit still." She'd looked at the kit when he'd first shown her the cabin. Really looked at it, the way she looked at anything she might eventually need. She knew what was in it. Whiskey. Not for drinking, but for cleaning, though it served both purposes. Carbolic acid, precious and carefully wrapped. A needle and thread. Bandage cloth. A scalpel blade, small and well-honed. She knew what she was going to have to do, and she did not allow herself to think about it in terms of its difficulty. She thought about it in terms of its steps. "The carbolic acid is going to hurt," she said. "I know what carbolic acid is," he said. "I know you know. I'm telling you so you're prepared, not so you can lecture me. Hold on to the bunk frame with your good hand." She heated water in the small iron pot. She laid out the supplies with the same methodical care she brought to everything. She sat beside him and she cleaned the wound in stages. First the whiskey, which made him hiss between his teeth and tighten his grip on the bunk frame. Then the carbolic acid, which made him go white and very still and produce a sound that was not quite anything recognizable. "Still with me?" she said. "Yes," he said, through teeth that were working hard. The wound was infected deep. She drained it as carefully as she could with the scalpel in her hands, working by lamplight in the early morning, the cabin cold except for the stove she'd stoked before coming through the partition. She didn't rush. She made herself not rush, because rushing this particular kind of work made it worse, not better. When she was done with the draining, she repacked it with clean cloth and whiskey and tied it off firmly. "You need to drink as much water as I can get into you," she said, "and you need to eat. Not because you want to, because the fever burns through what you have, and if there's nothing to burn through, it goes for something else." "I know," he said, but his voice was already thinner. The work of staying upright through the treatment had cost him. She helped him lie back. She put another blanket over him without being asked. She stoked the stove and made soup. Actual soup, not just broth, because there was a chicken she'd been saving for a stretch of bad weather, and this qualified. And she sat with him through the morning, bringing water and food at intervals, watching his color, checking the wound. He slept for 4 hours in the afternoon and woke more coherent. "You're good at that," he said. "Not thank you exactly, but something adjacent." "I had a father who didn't believe in stopping work until the work was done," she said. "He taught me to deal with problems before they got bigger. I applied it." "He sounds practical," Bram said. He was. He was also stubborn to the point of maddening. She looked at him steadily. "You would have liked each other." He almost smiled. It was brief and incomplete, but it was there. She made him rest for 3 days, which required more negotiation than the wound treatment had. He kept finding things that needed doing. She kept redirecting him. On the second day, he actually tried to argue that the trapline section nearest the cabin could be serviced in his condition, and she stood between him and his coat and looked at him until he sat back down. "The traps will wait," she said. "The catch won't." "Then the catch won't. You're not well enough." "You can't know. Your hand shook when you tried to pour your own coffee this morning," she said. "I watched. You need 2 more days." He said nothing to that. She serviced the nearest section herself the following day, alone, using his notes on the line layout. She came back with 3 mink and a beaver, which was respectable by any standard, and she set them to curing in the smokehouse before he found out what she'd done. When he came out of the cabin that evening and saw the smokehouse door latched against fresh catch, he stood there for a moment in the cold. She came to stand beside him. "You shouldn't have done that alone," he said. "Those lines have—" "I know what the lines have," she said. "You told me the week we arrived. I've been paying attention." He looked at her. The color was better in his face. The fever had broken fully in the night, and his eyes were clearer. "You've been paying attention to the trapline," he said, "since the beginning." "I pay attention to everything since the beginning," she said. "You said I'd learn. You were right." He looked back at the smokehouse. 3 mink and a beaver," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. "Come inside," he said. "You'll freeze out here." They went in. She put supper on. Neither of them said anything else about it, but the quality of the silence between them had shifted in some way that was hard to name. Less like 2 people operating in the same space, and more like 2 people who had, without quite planning it, started moving in the same direction. The winter outside pressed on. The fire held. March came in wrong. Bram knew it the morning he stepped onto the porch and felt the wind shift direction twice in the span of 10 minutes. First out of the northwest, then back around from the east, which was unusual, which meant the weather systems were fighting each other somewhere above the peaks, and the result of that fight was going to land on whoever was below it. He stood there with his coffee and watched the clouds build against the eastern ridge, and calculated how much of the trapline he could service before the weather made the decision for him. The answer, it turned out, was not enough. He made it to the 3rd section before the storm overtook him. Not a blizzard exactly, but a sustained driving sleet that turned every exposed surface into a skating rink and made visibility drop to maybe 30 feet. He got the traps checked and reset, lost a glove somewhere on the return leg, and didn't realize it until his right hand had gone from cold to something that felt like being stabbed repeatedly with small needles, and arrived back at the cabin an hour past, when Eliska would have expected him. She didn't say anything when he came through the door. She looked at his hand, then at his face, then at the gap where the glove should have been. "Sit," she said, and pointed at the chair nearest the stove. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. Your hand is white in 2 fingers. Sit down." He sat. She got a basin of cold water. Not warm, she'd learned that from her father. You never put frozen extremities into warm water right away. And she made him soak his hand while she hung his coat to dry and refilled his coffee and didn't make a production of any of it. "The storm came faster than it looked," he said. "I know. I watched it from the porch for an hour before you got back." "You were watching?" "Of course I was watching." She said it simply, without any particular weight behind it. She checked his fingers, pressing gently to test for response. "Any feeling coming back?" "Some. The tingling is starting." "That's good. Means circulation is returning." He sat there with his hand in the basin and drank his coffee left-handed and watched her move around the cabin with the particular efficiency she'd developed over the past months. Nothing wasted, nothing hurried, every motion landing exactly where it was meant to land. He'd noticed, over the course of the winter, that Eliska had a habit he didn't fully understand at first. She organized things. Not in the way of a person who needed order for comfort. He'd known people like that. People who fell apart when a shelf wasn't arranged correctly. but in the way of someone who was always preparing for a situation they couldn't fully predict. She would reshuffle the supply inventory before a storm and then reshuffle it when the storm was over, accounting for what had been used. She repositioned the axe handle under the porch railing twice before she decided it was in the right place. She kept a running mental count of the firewood in the shed and began cutting more when the count dropped below what she calculated they'd need for a bad week. He'd finally asked her about it one evening in February, and she'd looked at him like the question was only slightly less obvious than asking why people ate when they were hungry. Because the moment you need something and it isn't where it should be, she said, is never a moment when you have time to look for it. He thought about his missing glove and said nothing. The tingling in his fingers sharpened into proper pain, which meant the circulation was coming back in earnest. He tried not to show it. He was not particularly successful. "I know it hurts," she said, without looking at him. "I'm aware you know. I'm not saying it to make you feel better. I'm saying it because the pain means it's working and you can stop clenching your jaw in about 5 minutes." He made a deliberate effort to unclench his jaw. She almost smiled. He saw it. The brief compression of her lips that wasn't quite amusement, but wasn't anything other than amusement either, and she turned back to the stove before it became anything more. Outside, the sleet ticked against the shuttered windows. Inside, the stove worked steadily. It was, Bram thought, not for the first time, a strange and specific kind of life they had built in this 12 by 16-foot space. Two people who had agreed to nothing beyond the functional and who had somehow, without planning it or discussing it, built something that operated with the quiet coherence of a thing designed to last. He did not examine this thought too carefully. He was not by nature or by practice a man who examined things he couldn't see a use in examining, but he noticed it. The storm passed overnight and left 2 feet of new snow on a base that was already deep, which meant the next several days would be slower work. Snowshoes instead of the horse, shorter distances, more physical effort for less distance covered. He woke at 4 in the morning and lay still for a moment in the dark, listening to the cabin breathe. The small creaks of timber responding to temperature, the low murmur of the stove on Aliska's side of the partition, which meant she'd been up at 3 to feed it as she always was. This was not nothing. He knew enough about the world to know this was not nothing. A fire that never went out in the middle of winter in the northern Rockies was not an automatic thing. It was the result of someone getting out of a warm bunk at 3 in the morning every night, without complaint and without being asked twice. He got up and started his day. They fell into the work the way they'd fallen into everything, without discussing it, by a process of observation and adjustment that had become their primary mode of communication. He noticed she was favoring her right shoulder slightly, something she hadn't mentioned, and he quietly redistributed the morning wood hauling duty without making it a conversation. She noticed his left boot was wearing through at the heel and left his spare pair nearer the door without comment. These were very small things. They accumulated in the way that small things do. Mid-March brought something neither of them had fully prepared for, a stretch of nearly clear days, cold still but bright, with the sun at a new angle that meant spring was somewhere in the distant theoretical future. The light changed the character of the cabin. After months of lamplight and firelight, and the gray compression of storm weather, actual sun through the east window felt almost violent in its cheerfulness. Aliska stood in the patch of it one morning, just for a moment, her face tilted up, eyes closed. She didn't stay that way long, but Bram saw it and noted it with the same attention he gave to everything he saw, which was more than he generally let on. "How long since you've been in the sun?" he asked. She opened her eyes. "Before winter? Before the camp, maybe. You came across in autumn?" "Late summer, but I was working inside mostly. Kitchens, laundry, not a lot of time outside." "How long have you been on this continent?" She thought about it. "Nearly 2 years. It feels longer." "It usually does." He looked out the east window at the brightness on the snow. "Europe. Where exactly?" She told him. A city in Bohemia he had a vague geographical sense of but no real knowledge of. She described it briefly. Stone buildings, a river, winters cold, but nothing like this. A family that had been comfortable enough before a bad run of years that were beyond any one family's power to control. "What did your father do?" Bram said. "He was a carpenter," she said. "A good one. He built furniture, sometimes whole rooms. He had a precision about it. Things had to fit exactly or they didn't fit at all." She was quiet for a moment. He died 2 years before I left. Fever. I'm sorry, Bram said. He'd been sick a long time before that. The end wasn't a surprise. She said this with the particular steadiness of someone who had processed grief far enough that they could discuss it without it getting away from them. My mother and sisters were settled. There wasn't enough work for everyone, so I went. Just like that. Just like that, she said. There wasn't really a better option to spend a lot of time on. He recognized this logic because he'd applied his own version of it, at a different time and for different reasons. He'd left the town where he'd grown up at 22, with nothing particular in mind except the sense that the life laid out in front of him there was someone else's idea of a life, and not his. He'd ended up in the mountains by a process of gradual elimination that took several years and several intermediate places that weren't right. When he'd found the high country, he'd known immediately. Not because it was comfortable, it had never been comfortable, but because it made sense to him in a way nothing else had. He did not say any of this out loud. It was not the kind of thing he said out loud, but he thought about it while they were both looking at the snow-bright window, and the silence between them was the kind that had some content in it. Do you miss it? He asked. The city? Any of it. She considered this seriously, the way she considered most things. I miss my mother, she said. I miss my sisters. I miss the smell of the kitchen in the house I grew up in. I don't miss being cold and hungry in a country I didn't understand, which is what the last 2 years mostly were. She looked at the window again. I don't miss anything I had here, which isn't the same as not missing things. He nodded. Do you miss anything? She said. Have you been here the whole time, since you were young? Not the whole time. I was in other places. He paused. I had a wife. For a while. The information landed quietly in the room. She didn't push it. She didn't want the mountain, he said, after a moment. Not bitterly, just factually. She tried it for a season and she was honest about it. She wasn't made for this kind of life. We agreed on that. She went back down. I stayed up. He was quiet for a beat. It was a long time ago. We were both young, and neither of us really understood what we were agreeing to. Was it hard? Eliska asked. The leaving. All of it. He thought about this with more seriousness than the social script of such conversations usually required. The leaving was clean, he said. What was hard was the years after, when I had to figure out whether I was up here because I wanted it, or because it was the only thing I knew how to do. He looked at his coffee. I decided it was both, and that was enough. She was quiet for a moment. That's honest, she said. It's the only thing worth being, he said, and went to get his coat. The end of March brought the incident with the east fence, which would not have been an incident at all if Bram had been paying proper attention, and he knew it. He'd been repairing the fence line that marked the near edge of his property, more as habit than any real need, since no one was likely to come through in the remaining snow. When the post he was working on gave way unexpectedly, the frozen ground releasing it all at once instead of gradually. He went down with it, caught his boot in the hole, and felt something pull hard in his knee before he was even fully aware of what was happening. He sat in the snow for a moment, testing his weight on the joint. It wasn't broken. He knew what broken felt like. But the pull had been significant, and when he tried to stand, he found he could manage it only by distributing the weight wrong, which was itself a problem because the walk back to the cabin on uneven terrain in snowshoes was going to require both legs working more or less correctly. He made it back in about twice the time it should have taken, stopping twice to rest the knee, arriving at the cabin with his jaw set against the pane in a way that had apparently become recognizable. Eliska looked at him from across the room and said, What happened to your leg? Knee. It's not serious. Come sit down. I don't need... Bram. She was already moving toward the cabinet. If you finish that sentence with to sit down, I'm going to say something unkind. Sit. He sat. The examination was brief and functional. She pressed around the joint methodically, not gently, because gentle wasn't the same as careful, and asked him to flex and extend and tell her where the pain was worst. He did this with the cooperation of a man who had learned, over the past months, that arguing with her about medical matters was a reliable waste of time. It's not the joint itself, she said. Feels like a pulled muscle in the back of the knee. Probably the... She used a word in her first language, caught herself. The tissue behind, it should rest. I can't rest the knee for more than a day. 2 days minimum. 1. 1.5, she said. And you keep off it for the first morning of the second day. Use the walking stick by the door. He looked at the walking stick. He'd made it years ago for exactly this kind of situation and had used it perhaps twice. 1.5, he said. Agreed. She started wrapping the joint. You were fixing the east fence. Post gave way. I'll finish it, she said. You don't know which posts need... I know which posts need it, she said. I've been watching you work that line since November. The 3 on the north corner are the worst, and the one by the old deadfall is leaning. She tied off the wrap with more firmness than was strictly necessary. I'll take the spare mallet. I'll be back before the light goes. He looked at her. There were several things he could have said. He chose none of them. Watch the ground under the deadfall, he said. It's soft, even when it looks frozen. Don't put your full weight on it without testing first. I know, she said. You told me that in December. I'm telling you again. I heard you again, she said, and went to get her coat. She came back before the light went, with the fence repaired and her boots caked in snow, and the particular look of someone who has been working in cold air for several hours and found it, on the whole, not unwelcome. She didn't announce the success of the fence work. She just came in, knocked the snow from her boots, checked his knee wrap once without asking, and started supper. He ate with the walking stick propped against the table beside him, and didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, The deadfall? Soft, she said. I didn't put my full weight on it. Good, he said. She set a bowl in front of him that had more meat in it than the portions usually ran, because she knew he needed to eat when he was injured, whether or not he was hungry, and she knew he wouldn't argue about it if it was already in front of him. He ate it. He didn't argue. Outside, the March wind worked at the eaves with the particular sound it made when it was losing conviction. Not the hard, driving howl of deep winter, but something more irregular, more questioning. It was still cold. It would be cold for weeks yet. But it was not the same cold it had been in January, and somewhere in the distance that both of them could feel without being able to articulate, the mountain was thinking about changing. Neither of them mentioned this. They did the dishes together that night, which wasn't something they'd planned. He'd tried to get up to do his own, and she was already there, and they'd ended up working side by side at the washstand in the kind of accidental proximity that happens in small spaces, passing things back and forth without looking, rinsing and stacking with the efficiency of people who've learned each other's rhythms well enough that the rhythm itself becomes the communication. At one point their hands were in the basin at the same time, and neither of them moved away immediately. A half second, maybe a full one. Then the moment passed and they finished the dishes, and she went to her side of the partition and he to his, and the stove settled into its low nighttime murmur. Bram lay on his bunk and looked at the ceiling and did not examine what he was thinking because he had already established firmly that he was not a man who examined things he couldn't see a use in examining. But the warmth in the cabin was real, and the knowledge that it would still be there at 3 a.m. was real, and so was everything else that winter had made between them, whether he named it or not. April arrived the way it always did at elevation, not as a relief but as a negotiation. The snow didn't retreat so much as it argued, pulling back from the south-facing slopes in the cabin's porch steps, while holding firm everywhere else, the drifts against the north wall still chest-high, still dense with the packed weight of 5 months of accumulation. The days got longer. The light had a different quality to it, less flat, more angled, and on clear afternoons it came through the east window with enough warmth to actually move across the floor in a visible bar of gold that Bram had forgotten existed until he saw it again. He didn't say anything about the light, but he stopped walking through it. His knee had healed well enough. 2.5 days of rest instead of 1.5, because on the morning of the second day, Eliska had looked at the swelling and simply not moved his walking stick from beside the door, and he'd looked at her and done the math on whether it was worth the argument. It wasn't. He'd spent the extra half day sharpening every blade in the cabin that needed sharpening, which was a productive use of the time and also something he could do sitting down without her being able to object to it. She hadn't objected. She'd watched him work for a moment from across the room with an expression he'd cataloged somewhere between approval and amusement, and then she'd gone back to her own work. That was March. April was different. Something had shifted in the cabin's atmosphere that Bram couldn't entirely account for, and didn't entirely try to. It wasn't tension exactly. It was more like the particular awareness of two people who had spent enough time in close proximity to run out of the easy distances, the polite gaps, the professional spacing, and were now navigating something more complicated without having agreed to navigate anything at all. He noticed things he had no business noticing, the way she pushed her hair back from her face when she was focused on something difficult, the specific sound of her moving around before dawn, lighter-footed than he was, more economical, no wasted steps. The fact that she laughed rarely, but when she did it was sudden and completely unguarded, nothing performed about it, and the first time he'd heard it, over a batch of biscuits that had come out shaped like nothing recognizable, he'd felt something shift in his chest that he'd subsequently refused to investigate. The rifle was what broke things open between them. Not emotionally, not in the way of confessions or declarations, neither of which were in either of their natures, but in the practical sense that forced the question of what, exactly, they were to each other out into the open air where it had to be addressed. He'd been meaning to teach her to shoot since October. He'd said so. We'll deal with that later. And later had kept being later because there was always something more immediate, and because some part of him had not fully committed to the idea of putting his rifle in her hands, which was a feeling he examined and found somewhat embarrassing when he looked at it directly. It wasn't about trust. He trusted her competence more than he trusted most people's. It was something else. The rifle was his, specifically, a relationship between a man and a tool built over 15 years of use, and teaching her to use it felt like an acknowledgement of something he hadn't decided whether to acknowledge. He came to the decision the way he came to most decisions, by looking at the facts and finding that only one conclusion made sense. They were 6 weeks from the snow breaking enough for travel. In those 6 weeks, anything could happen. He knew this better than anyone. The previous spring, he'd had a confrontation with two men who'd gotten confused in the passes and ended up at his cabin half-starved and more dangerous for it. The spring before that, a bear had come out of winter hungry enough to try the cabin door. The mountain in spring was not safer than the mountain in winter. In some ways, it was less safe because winter kept most threats frozen and spring thaw released them all at once. He could not always be between Aliska and whatever came. He'd already demonstrated this more than once. So on a clear Wednesday morning in early April, he took the rifle down from above the door and he said, "Come outside." She looked at the rifle, then at him. "Now?" she said. "Good visibility. Not too cold. Now's as good as it gets." She put on her coat. He'd done this before, taught other people to shoot, back in earlier years when he'd had occasion to. He knew the sequence. Safety first, mechanics second, position third, sight picture fourth, trigger last. He knew how to explain it. What he hadn't anticipated was how difficult he'd find it to simply hand the rifle over. He stood behind her and talked her through the grip and the stock position, and when she raised it to her shoulder, he reached forward to adjust the angle and stopped himself, and she noticed. "You can correct the position," she said. "I won't be offended." "I know you won't," he said. "Then, the stock is too long for you," he said. "You're compensating. You need to bring your cheek further down to meet it, but the geometry is wrong for your reach." He took the rifle back, looked at it. "This is built for my frame. The pull length is wrong for you." "Can I still shoot it?" "Yes. It'll be less accurate and the recoil will catch you wrong. But you can fire it." She held out her hand for it. He gave it back. They spent 2 hours on the basics. She was not a natural shot. She said so herself, without apparent distress, as a factual observation. But she was an attentive student who understood immediately that the variables she could control were position, breathing, and trigger squeeze, and she focused on those with the same methodical attention she brought to everything else. By the end of the first session, she was hitting the mark reliably at 30 yards. "Better than I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" she said. "Less consistency," he admitted. "Most people fight the recoil. You don't." "Fighting it doesn't change it," she said, handing the rifle back. "It just makes you tense before the thing you're trying to do. That doesn't help." He cleaned the rifle that evening and sat with it across his knees for a long time, turning something over in his mind. Then he opened the toolbox and took out his smallest plane and his measuring rule. She was across the partition. He could hear her moving, the soft sounds of her evening routine, which he now knew as well as his own. He laid the rifle stock across the workbench. He worked for 4 hours. When he was done, the stock was shorter, not drastically, but precisely, by the measurement he'd taken in his head that afternoon while watching her shoot. It would change the pull length. It would correct the geometry. It was irreversible. You could not put wood back once it was gone. And the rifle had been his for 15 years, and the thought of what he was doing with it had never occurred to him in any context before today. He set it down and looked at it in the lamplight. It didn't feel like a sacrifice. That was the strange part. It felt like a correction, like he'd noticed something that wasn't right and fixed it, which was what he did with every problem that came in front of him. He told himself this and went to bed. He showed her in the morning without explanation, just handed her the rifle and let her bring it to her shoulder. She felt the difference immediately. He saw it in her posture, the way the stock settled correctly against her cheek without the compensatory angle she'd been using. She lowered it and looked at the stock. "You shortened it," she said, "adjusted the pull length." "You adjusted your rifle," she said, and the careful neutrality in her voice told him she understood exactly what that meant, even if she wasn't going to make more of it than he put there. "It's more useful to both of us this way," he said. She looked at the rifle for another moment. Then she raised it to her shoulder again and put the front sight on the distant pine he'd been using as a target marker and was quiet for a long breath. "Thank you," she said, and she didn't mean for the rifle. He knew she didn't mean for the rifle. "We'll do another session tomorrow," he said. "Longer range." She nodded and handed it back, and neither of them said anything else about it. The longer range session came the following afternoon, and it was during this session, with Eliska lying prone in the snow and working through sight corrections at 60 yards, that Bram first heard the sound that didn't belong. He'd been watching her through a routine that required concentration and silence, so he almost dismissed the noise as wind through rock formations. Then he heard it again, not wind, which was consistent, but the irregular sound of something moving through snow under its own direction. Too heavy for an animal at this range. He put his hand on her shoulder. She stopped moving immediately. He put one finger to his lips. She nodded. They stayed still. The sound continued, resolved itself. 2 sets of footsteps, both uneven, the particular rhythm of people who were exhausted and cold and moving as fast as their bodies would allow, which wasn't fast enough. Bram's hand was already near the rifle. Then the voice came, ragged, wind-shredded, calling out toward the cabin. "Hello, the house. We need help. We're not armed." Bram looked at the direction. Eliska read his face and got to one knee, the rifle across her lap. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Keep that in hand." "I'm not staying here," she said. "I'm asking—" "I heard you," she said. "I'm coming. 2 people are easier to read than 1. He looked at her. He didn't have time to argue it, and she was not wrong. They came around the north side of the cabin together, Bram in front, and found 2 men at the porch steps in a condition that told its own story. Gaunt-faced, several days of bad weather, and insufficient food in their bearing, boots wrong for mountain terrain, clothes that had been adequate for lower elevation but not for what they'd been through. One of them was supporting the other, who had gone beyond exhaustion into something approaching shutdown. "We came up from the South Pass," the first man said. His name, he said, was Aldrin. He didn't offer the other man's name right away. "We were heading for the Clement mine. 2 days in the wrong direction, and then the weather—" He stopped. "I know how this looks." "How does it look?" Bram said, "like 2 drifters showing up to a remote cabin with a story." "That's what it looks like," Bram said. "What is it?" "The same thing," Aldrin said, with honesty that was either genuine or very well performed. "We don't want trouble. My partner can't walk much farther. We need water and a place to get warm for a few hours." Eliska was standing to Bram's left and slightly behind, the rifle at her side, not raised, but present. Bram looked at the 2 men the way he'd looked at problems his whole life. Not with fear, not with charity, but with a cold assessment of the variables. The injured man, whose name turned out to be Cutter, had frostbite in 2 toes and a core temperature that concerned Bram more than he let on. Whatever these men were or weren't, leaving them outside was a death sentence for at least one of them. "You go around back," he said to Aldrin, "through the woodshed entrance. You wait there until I open the door." "Why around back?" Aldrin said. "Because I said so. You come through the front, you don't come in at all." Aldrin looked at him, then at Eliska and the rifle at her side. He nodded and moved without further discussion. Inside, Bram spoke quietly to Eliska while Cutter was settled near the stove. "Keep the rifle where you can reach it." Not in hand, but reachable. I know, she said. Don't let either of them between you and the door. I know, Bram. He looked at her. I don't know who they are. Neither do I, she said. We'll find out. She handed him a bowl of broth to take to Cutter. Feed him first. Hungry people are unpredictable. Full people are easier to read. He took the bowl. He almost said something. He went across the cabin instead. Aldrin and Cutter stayed 4 hours. Bram and Aliska were never both inattentive at the same moment. Not because they'd discussed it, but because they'd spent 5 months developing an operational awareness of each other that translated, under mild threat, into something that looked almost like a choreography. When Bram sat at the table talking to Aldrin, Aliska was at the stove with an unobstructed line to the rifle on the wall. When she brought food to the table, Bram repositioned slightly so that both of their guests were in his direct eye line. Aldrin noticed. He was not a stupid man. He looked between the two of them at one point with a slightly surprised expression. You two been up here long, he said. Long enough, Bram said. You work well together. Neither Bram nor Aliska said anything to this. The mine we're heading to, Aldrin said, changing course, might be hiring on for the summer season. If you know any men looking, we're not looking, Bram said. Aldrin nodded. He ate what was in front of him and didn't push any further, and after 4 hours, the two men left with enough dried food to get them to the lower trail, Cutter's feet wrapped properly, both of them heading in the correct direction. Bram watched them out of sight before coming back inside. Aliska was at the window. They were what they said they were, she said. Not a question. Probably, Bram said. Maybe 85%. The other 15? Gone with them, he said, which is where it should be. She nodded and turned from the window. She looked tired, not from the physical work of the day, but from the particular fatigue of sustained alertness, the kind of tiredness that came from keeping every sense engaged for hours without release. Bram knew the feeling precisely. Sit down, he said. She looked at him. I mean it. Sit down. I'll make coffee. She sat. He made coffee. It was not remarkable coffee. It was the same coffee he made every morning, strong and functional, and not designed to be pleasant so much as useful. But he put it in front of her without ceremony and sat across the table instead of retreating to the workbench, and they sat there in the late afternoon light, and neither of them said anything for a long time. You handled that well, he said, eventually. We handled it, she said. He conceded this with a slight nod. Outside, the April afternoon was moving into evening, the light dropping gold across the snow-covered clearing in front of the cabin. The mountain was quieter than it had been all winter. The absence of wind after months of wind was its own presence, a held-breath stillness that felt like something between ending and beginning. Aliska wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and looked at the light on the snow. 6 weeks, she said. About that, he said, and then the pass opens. Give or take. She was quiet for a moment. He didn't look at her directly because looking at her directly in moments like this was the kind of thing he'd learned to be careful with, the way you learn to be careful with an open flame in a room full of dry wood. Are you ready for it to be over? She asked. The question was simple, and she asked it simply, but it had weight in it. He thought about answering it with something functional, a reference to the season's catch, the condition of the supplies, the list of repairs the cabin would need before next winter. He'd gotten good at that over the years, redirecting the personal question into the practical answer. He didn't do it this time. No, he said. She looked at him. He met her eyes and held them for a moment, longer than was casual, shorter than was declarative. And then he looked at his coffee. The cabin runs better with 2 people, he said. Which was true, and also not what he'd meant entirely. And she knew it was not entirely what he'd meant, and he knew that she knew, and neither of them pushed it further. The light moved across the floor. The stove ticked quietly. Outside, somewhere distant in the melting dark, a single bird made a sound that neither of them had heard since October, because birds that made that sound didn't winter at elevation, and its presence meant the mountain's long argument with spring was, finally, being lost. Aliska heard it too. He saw her head tilt slightly. What is that? She asked. Mountain bluebird, he said. Early. She listened until the sound faded. Is that good or bad? He thought about it. Neither, he said. It just means something's changing. She nodded slowly and finished her coffee. The man came on a Thursday. Bram knew the day because he'd been marking the calendar on the wall beside the workbench with the same mechanical regularity he'd maintained since October. Not out of sentimentality, but because losing track of the date in deep winter was how you made avoidable mistakes. Missed the window for critical supply runs, miscalculated how much firewood you had left against how many cold nights remained. The mark for Thursday, April 17th, was the last thing he'd made that morning before going out to check the trap line's northern section, which had been running light, and he wanted to know why. He'd been gone since before sunrise. Eliska was alone when the stranger appeared at the tree line. She'd been splitting kindling on the porch. Not because the supply was low, it wasn't, but because the morning was the clearest it had been in 2 weeks, and the physical work felt good after a night of poor sleep, and the axe was something she'd gotten genuinely comfortable with over the winter, the weight of it familiar now in a way it hadn't been in November. She heard him before she saw him. The snow on the far side of the clearing had a particular sound when it was disturbed by weight, a compression and squeak distinct from wind movement, and her head came up before she'd consciously registered why. He was standing at the edge of the pines. 40 yards, maybe 45. He had a rifle slung over one shoulder, and his coat was too thin for the elevation, and his eyes were moving across the cabin with the careful inventory of a man calculating something. She set the axe down on the chopping block, deliberately, so her hands were empty and visible. She did not step back toward the door. Stepping back would tell him something she didn't want him to know yet. "Help you?" she called. He came forward without being invited, which told her something. He stopped about 20 feet away and looked at her with the particular look of a man revising his expectations. He'd expected an empty cabin, or a man, or something other than what he found. "Where's the man of the place?" he said. "Working," she said. "When's he back?" "When his work is done," she said. "What do you need?" He wasn't young, late 40s maybe, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent a lot of years outdoors, and not all of them productively. There was a quality to his stillness that she recognized from the camp, the particular composure of men who were comfortable with the possibility of violence, who'd stopped flinching from it so long ago they'd forgotten that most people still did. "Came a long way," he said. "Need food and a place to wait out the afternoon. Storm's building west." She looked west. He was right about the storm. She'd watched the cloud bank building since mid-morning. But people who were simply desperate and cold didn't lead with questions about when the man of the house was coming back. They led with the cold and the hunger. "I can give you food," she said. "You can eat it out here. I'll bring something." His expression shifted. Not angry yet. The precursor to it. "Seems unfriendly," he said. "I'm a woman alone in a remote cabin," she said. "Unfriendly keeps me safe. You do the same." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the cabin door. Then back at her. "What's in there worth keeping a man out in the cold for?" he said. "Privacy," she said. She went inside. She moved fast, took the rifle from above the door first, checked it by habit and muscle memory now, the shortened stock fitting perfectly against her palm. She put it beside the door frame where she could reach it with one step. Then she put cold biscuits and a piece of dried meat on a cloth and went back to the porch. He hadn't moved. That was the one sign of patience she couldn't decide how to read. She held the food out. He took it. He ate standing up, looking at the cabin, and she stood on the porch and watched him eat without pretending not to watch him. "You been up here all winter," he said between bites. "That's not your business," she said, "just making conversation." "You're not," she said. "You're asking how long you've been traveling and whether you're too far up to run into anyone who knows this place. The answer to both questions isn't something I'm going to give you." He stopped chewing, looked at her with something new in his expression. Not respect exactly, but a recalibration. "You're sharp," he said. "Finish your food," she said. He finished it. He handed back the cloth with a deliberateness that might have been politeness or might have been a reason to step closer. And she took it without stepping toward him, let him close the gap if he chose to, kept her weight on her back foot, kept her body between him and the door. He did step closer, 2 feet. "I need more than food," he said. His voice was different now. The conversational layer was gone. "What you need and what you're going to get aren't the same thing today," she said. "You should start back down before the weather closes in." Or, he said. I go inside and see what's worth keeping to myself. You won't, she said. Why not? Because the man who lives here is going to be back in the next 2 hours, and whatever you're thinking about doing takes longer than 2 hours if you want to come out of it walking. He looked at her, testing the truth of it. And, she said, there's a rifle inside that door that I know how to use. I learned this winter. I'm not a natural shot, but I'm accurate enough at this distance, and you're standing close enough that it doesn't matter much whether I'm natural or not. It was a long silence, the kind that had decisions in it. He looked at the door. He looked at her. He looked at the distance between himself and the tree line. And he was doing his own mathematics. She could see it, weighing what was known against what wasn't. And men like this, she knew from hard experience, did not generally gamble on unknowns when they were already operating at a disadvantage. He took a step back. Tell the man of the place a traveler came through, he said. His voice was flat. I'll tell him, she said. He went back to the tree line without hurrying. She watched him go, and she watched the trees after he disappeared into them for another 20 minutes, marking his direction of travel by the occasional movement in the upper branches, confirming he was continuing west and not circling back. Then she went inside, and she sat down in the chair nearest the stove, and she let her hands shake for 30 seconds. Then she got up and went back to the kindling. Bram came back in the early afternoon. He came through the porch and saw the axe still on the chopping block and the cleared area around it, and read something in the arrangement. The track patterns in the snow, slightly different, facing directions that didn't match a normal morning's work. He looked at Aliska. What happened? He said. She told him. All of it, straight through, without embellishment or minimization. He stood in the doorway through the whole account without moving, his coat still on, listening with the particular focused stillness of a man running an assessment. You didn't let him in, he said when she finished. No. You put the rifle by the door? Yes. And he left. West, along the ridge line. He's not coming back, not today. I don't know about later. Bram came inside and closed the door and stood at the window for a moment, looking at the tree line. You handled that right, he said. I know, she said. I want to know who he is. I don't know everyone who comes through the mountains, Bram said. You know the types, she said. What was he? Bram thought about it. Opportunist, he said. Looking for an easy mark. Undefended cabin, early spring, the kind of place that's been stocked all winter and the owner might be getting careless. He's not the first I've seen come through in late April. He turned from the window. They usually go around places that look occupied and defended. You gave him the clear picture on both counts. He might come back with more information, she said, or with someone else. He might, Bram said. Which is why you and I are going to have a conversation I've been putting off. She looked at him. I should have had it 2 months ago, he said, but I kept assuming the season would end before it became necessary. He sat down at the table, which was something he did when he intended a real conversation rather than a working exchange. This is the third confrontation we've had this winter. The drifters, the coyote, and now this. That's not unusual for a spring. It's usually once, maybe twice. 3 means the winter was bad enough that there are more desperate people moving through the passes than in a normal year, and we've got another 4 to 6 weeks before the snow clears enough that the risk drops. What are you proposing? She said. Routine, he said. Things we do automatically, so neither of us is caught without the other knowing where they are. Morning and evening check-in. You don't go outside the perimeter alone without telling me first. I don't go to the north line without giving you a return time and a signal protocol if I'm late. She was quiet for a moment. You've been doing most of that already, she said. Informally. Informally isn't enough, he said. I need you to know that if I tell you I'm back by dark and I'm not back by 2 hours past dark, you don't wait. You take the rifle and the emergency pack under the workbench and you go down. Go down to where? She said. The lower trail shelter. You know where it is, I showed you in November. You wait there for 1 day. If I'm not there in 1 day, you keep going to Harrow Gulch. She looked at him steadily. And if something happens to me, she said, what do you do? The same, he said. Roughly, except I'm better suited to dealing with the mountain end of it. You mean if I'm taken, she said, not just delayed. His jaw tightened slightly. Yes, he said, That's what I mean. Then say it directly. If you're taken, he said, I come after you. That's not a conversation. That's a fact. She held his gaze. He held hers. There was nothing romantic in the moment. It was the opposite of romance, actually, because it was entirely serious and the thing being said was not a feeling but a commitment. And commitments in this place meant something because the mountain had a way of collecting on them. All right, she said. I'll take the protocols. Good, he said. He stood and went to the workbench and pulled out a piece of paper, and they spent the next hour writing down what they'd agreed, in practical terms, every contingency they could think of, the procedures they'd follow, and the order of decisions. It was not a beautiful document. It was a functional one. And when they were done, they both read it through and made 2 corrections, and then Bram tacked it to the inside of the cabinet door where the medical kit sat, and they both knew exactly where it was. The near stranger had done them a service, in a way, forced explicit what had been operating on assumption. The following day was harder in the way that days after threats sometimes were. A particular flatness, a hangover from sustained alertness. Aliska moved through her work with a quietness that Bram recognized as her version of processing something difficult. He gave her the space, which was the appropriate response, and focused on the practical work of reinforcing the latch on the woodshed door and moving certain supplies closer to the exit points in a configuration he should have done in October. Late in the afternoon, she came and stood beside him while he worked the woodshed latch, and watched him for a minute. I want to go over the rifle protocol again, she said. He stopped what he was doing. Not because yesterday shook me, she said quickly, and then stopped. Actually, yes, because yesterday shook me. A little. I handled it fine, but... She paused. I want to be better prepared than fine. He looked at her. She was being honest with him in a way that cost her something, and he registered this without making it a production. Tomorrow morning, he said. Longer range. We'll do moving scenarios. Moving scenarios? Target isn't standing still, he said. Neither are you. She nodded. All right. He went back to the latch. She stayed beside him for another moment, not helping, just present. Then she went back to the cabin. The rifle sessions over the following week were different from the early ones in March. Less instructional, more operational. Bram set up scenarios that required actual decision-making, target at unpredictable angles, multiple objects in the field of view, movement at different speeds. She missed more than she hit in the first 2 sessions. By the third, she was hitting consistently enough that he stopped counting misses. You're rushing the sight picture when you're moving, he said one afternoon, crouching beside her in the snow while she lay prone. You're trying to fire at the same moment you stabilize. You need 1 full breath after you stop moving. 1 breath feels like a long time, she said. It is a long time, he said. Use it anyway. She tried it, 1 breath after stopping. The next 3 shots landed exactly where they were supposed to. Better, he said. You could have told me that in March, she said. You weren't ready for it in March, he said. In March, you were learning to hold the rifle. You can't learn everything at once. She rolled onto her side and looked up at him. How do you know when someone's ready? He thought about it. When they stop thinking about the mechanics, he said. When the mechanics become automatic and the thinking goes to the problem instead. You weren't there in March. You're there now. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Is that how you decided I was ready to know about the emergency protocols? When I stopped thinking about the basics? He looked at her. The question was sharper than she'd made it sound. Partly, he said. What was the other part? The man at the tree line, he said. He reminded me that ready or not doesn't always wait for the right moment. She sat up and brushed snow from her coat and looked at the distant tree line, the same one where the stranger had appeared 3 days ago. Do you think he's still out there? She said. No, Bram said. Men like that move on when the easy option closes. He found a closed option here. He looked at her. Because you closed it. She picked up the rifle and dusted snow from the barrel with practiced care, the same way he'd shown her to do it in October. The pass is going to open in 3 weeks, she said. Maybe less if this warm stretch holds. About that, he said. And then I go down to Harrow Gulch, she said. And you pay me what you owe me. He'd known this was coming. It had to come. It had been the term since October, and he'd been watching its approach the way he watched incoming weather, with full knowledge, and without any particular plan for what to do when it arrived. That's what we agreed, he said. She stood and slung the rifle and looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, which was unusual. He'd gotten good at reading her. Do you want to renegotiate? She said. The question was careful. Not leading, not pressuring, just a question put clearly in front of him the way she put all difficult things, directly, without decoration, and with the specific patience of someone who genuinely did not know the answer and was waiting for it without assumption. He looked at her. The April light was doing something to the clearing around them. Long shadows from the pines, the particular late afternoon gold that had no equivalent in any other season. The snow was reduced to patches now, the ground showing through in places, dark and wet and smelling of something that had been frozen all winter and was just beginning to remember itself. I don't know yet, he said. It was the most honest answer he had. She nodded once, as if this was a reasonable response. Maybe it was. She started back toward the cabin and he fell into step beside her, and the space between them walking was neither close nor far, but something in the middle that had its own particular character, and neither of them adjusted it. The mountain held its breath above them. 3 weeks. Maybe less. 3 weeks turned out to be 17 days. The warm stretch held and then pushed further than either of them expected, the kind of early May heat that arrived without apology and turned the snowpack from solid to compromised almost overnight. Bram walked the south-facing trail on a Tuesday morning and came back with mud on his boots up to the ankle and the news that the pass was clear enough for horses to manage it without risk. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without preamble, standing in the doorway. Eliska was at the workbench mending a split in one of the pack saddle straps. She didn't look up immediately. She finished the stitch she was on, which took maybe 10 more seconds, and then she set down the awl and looked at him. How clear, she said. Clear enough, he said. We could go day after tomorrow. All right, she said. She picked up the awl again and went back to the strap. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than the conversation required, and then he went to check the horses. The following day they packed. This was a practical and mostly silent operation that didn't have much room for anything but itself. The winter's accumulated catch needed to be loaded. The cabin needed to be secured against the empty months ahead. The horses needed proper preparation for the descent. There was a checklist, and they worked through it, as they'd worked through everything, by a division of labor that had long since stopped requiring any discussion. But there were moments in it, small ones. She found the emergency protocol document still tacked to the inside of the cabinet door and stood looking at it for a moment before unpinning it. He saw her fold it carefully instead of throwing it away and put it in her coat pocket, and he said nothing about this. He took the rifle down from above the door and broke it down for travel, wrapping each piece with the cloth he used for long hauls. She watched him from across the room, and when he set it on the pack pile, something crossed her face that she didn't give words to, and he didn't ask for. The night before the descent, they ate well. The last of the better stores, things she'd been rationing since March, now freed from the necessity of preservation. She made a proper meal of it, as close to a real supper as the supplies would allow, and they sat across the table and ate it in the last light through the east window, the same bar of afternoon gold that had surprised him back in March. I've been thinking about your question, he said. She looked up. You asked if I wanted to renegotiate, he said. 3 weeks ago. I remember, she said. I said I didn't know. You did. He moved his fork once across the plate and set it down and looked at her directly, which was how he addressed things he decided were worth addressing directly. I know now, he said. She waited. I want you to stay, he said. Not on the same terms. Different terms. Better ones. He paused. But I'm not going to tell you what those terms should be. That's your part of it. I've held enough back this year that the least I can do is put the next part in your hands. She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was unreadable in the way it got when she was thinking carefully about something rather than reacting to it. That's more than I expected you to say, she said. I'm aware, he said. I've been working up to it since March. Something passed across her face that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. I know, she said. I watched you working up to it. He looked at her. Was it obvious? To me, she said. I don't think it was obvious to you. He picked up his fork again. "Eat," he said. Because there wasn't a clean response to that, and they both knew it. And she picked up her fork, and they finished the meal and did the dishes for the last time, and went to their respective sides of the partition, and the cabin held its old familiar quiet. He lay on his bunk and looked at the ceiling. He thought about what she'd said. "I don't think it was obvious to you." And he thought about how accurate that was, and how long he'd spent in this particular life developing a very thorough understanding of the visible world and a nearly complete blindness to the interior one. He'd understood the mountain from the first year. He'd understood trapping lines and weather systems and the behavior of animals under stress and the properties of frozen wood and the specific silence that preceded an avalanche. He'd built a life of expertise from the outside in, from the observable to the known. What Eliska had done without trying and without asking permission was reverse the direction. She'd come at him from the inside out, from the small daily observations, the way he moved when he was in pain, the way his voice dropped when something genuinely troubled him, the fact that he expressed care through labor rather than language. She'd assembled an understanding of him that was more accurate than anything he'd achieved about himself in 41 years. This was, he thought in the dark, either the most alarming thing that had happened to him or the most necessary. He couldn't fully separate those two possibilities and stopped trying. He was asleep before he resolved it, which was probably for the best. They left at first light. The descent was harder than the ascent had been, which was always the way. The mountain gave nothing for free in either direction. The horses were careful on the softened trail, each step considered, the weight of the loaded packs requiring constant adjustment on the switchbacks. Bram went first and Eliska followed, the same configuration as the climb in October, but the silence between them was nothing like that earlier silence. That silence had been the absence of anything. This one was full. Halfway down, where the trail widened at the granite shelf and both horses could walk abreast, she came alongside him without prompting, and they rode the flat stretch side by side. He didn't comment on this. Neither did she. They passed the snow line. The air changed, got thicker, wetter, smelling of pine sap and mud, and the particular organic richness of a mountain in spring that had nothing in common with winter's clean cold. Bird sounds came back. Not just the bluebird, but a full spectrum of them, overlapping, the mountain advertising its recovery to anyone who would listen. "It's louder than I remember," she said. "Everything's loud after winter," he said. "You adjust back." "I'm not sure I want to adjust back," she said. She said it simply, not as a complaint. "To the noise." "To all of it," she said. "The noise is just the part I notice first." He looked at her. She was watching the trees, and the light was different down here, softer and more complicated than the clean elevation light, and it did something to the lines of her face that he registered and cataloged alongside everything else he'd spent 6 months cataloging without permission from himself. "You said better terms," she said, not looking at him, "before we left. What do you mean by better?" "Equal," he said. "Not employer and hired hand, that's done. It doesn't fit what happened this winter, and it would be dishonest to pretend it does." "Equal how?" she said. "Equal in the decisions," he said, "about the cabin, the land, the trap line, what we do with it, and what we build on it." He paused. "Equal in everything that matters, which is most things." She was quiet for a long stretch of trail. He let the quiet be. "You're not good at saying what you mean," she said. "I know," he said. "You're getting better." "Marginally?" he said. "Marginally is enough," she said. "I'm not looking for a man who says everything perfectly. I've met men who say everything perfectly. They were the ones who kept promising things they didn't deliver." She looked at him then. "You don't promise things." "No," he said. "But you deliver them," she said. "That's the difference." He thought about the rifle stock under his workbench plane, the 2.5 days of rest instead of 1.5, the emergency protocol document written out and tacked to the cabinet door, the 4 hours of firewood she'd found split and stacked on her side of the porch one morning in January that he'd never mentioned. Small things, a whole winter of them. The language of two people who expressed themselves in action because words were insufficient or unavailable, or both. "What do you want, Eliska?" he said. "Specifically, don't let me define it for you." She thought about this for a while. He gave her the time. The trail narrowed and they went single file for 100 yards, and then widened again, and she came back alongside him. "I want to go back up," she said, "at the end of summer when the stores are restocked and the repairs are done. I want to go back up for another winter." She paused. "Not as your housekeeper, as your partner. I want to learn the full trap line, not just the near sections. I want to know this mountain the way you know it, and I want to be useful to it, and I want—" She stopped. "Say the rest," he said. "I want to stop being careful," she said. "I've been careful for 2 years. In the camp and in the cabin and in every conversation we've had since October. I'm tired of it. I want to be somewhere I don't have to be careful about what I am." He heard this clearly. All of it, including the part that was about more than the mountain. "You don't have to be careful with me," he said. "You haven't had to be careful with me since November. You chose to be, and that's yours. But I want you to know that's not something I require." She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was open in a way he hadn't seen it before, not unguarded exactly. She was always precise, always present, but unbuttoned in some way, the careful professional surface she maintained with most of the world set aside. "I know," she said. "That's why I said it." They came into the lower valley by mid-afternoon, and the world expanded around them the way it always did on the descent. The narrow mountain corridor opening into breadth, sky increasing, sound multiplying. Harrow Gulch was visible in the distance, its particular sprawl of timber and canvas and smoke, and even from this distance it had the quality of something that had nothing to do with either of them anymore. Bram looked at it. He'd been looking at Harrow Gulch for 20 years, and it had always represented the same thing, the necessary transaction with the world below, endured and completed and left behind. He'd never wanted to be in it longer than he had to be. He glanced at Eliska. She was looking at it too, and her expression was the one he'd learned to read as calculation. Not coldness, but the specific focus of a person weighing variables. "We need to go in," he said. "I need to settle accounts with Dolan and pick up the spring supply list. You—" He stopped. "I need to collect what you owe me," she said, "and then decide what to do with it." "Yes," he said. They rode the rest of the way without speaking. Harrow Gulch received them the way it received everything, with indifferent noise and the smell of wet wood and commerce. Dolan was at his store, as he'd been in October, and seemed mildly surprised to see both of them arrive together and apparently intact. "Survived the winter," Dolan said, which was his version of welcome. "Survived it fine," Bram said. He put his supply list on the counter and started the accounting. Dolan worked through it, and the numbers came out, and Bram settled what he owed, and then he paid Eliska. The agreed wage in full, 6 months, in coin rather than scrip, because scrip was only useful in Harrow Gulch, and he wasn't going to constrain her options. She held the money without counting it. She looked at it in her palm. "That's what we agreed," he said. "I know," she said. "It's more than I expected it to feel like." He waited. She looked around the store. Through the window she could see the main street of Harrow Gulch, the same street where she'd been wringing laundry in October, the same mud and noise and desperate industry. 2 women were coming out of the boarding house across the way. A mule was being led toward the hitching rail. Everything exactly as she'd left it, and completely foreign. "I'm going to see if Dolan has what's on the winter supply list," she said. He went still. "Next season's supply list," she said, looking at him. "The one you've been building since March." He looked at her. "I haven't given you that list," he said. "No," she said. "But you left it on the workbench last week and I read it." "You read my supply list." "You leave it sitting out," she said. "I read things that are sitting out." She turned to Dolan. "Do you have a catalog?" Dolan, who had been following this exchange with the carefully neutral expression of a man who had learned that whatever happened in his store was better observed than participated in, produced a catalog from under the counter. She went through it methodically. Bram stood beside her and watched her finger move down the columns, checking items against a list that lived in her head rather than on paper, pulling what she needed and setting it aside with the same efficient precision she'd brought to everything since October. After a moment, he reached over and pulled the catalog to his side and found the section on tools. She glanced at him. "You need a better axe," he said. "The one at the cabin is starting to develop a crack in the handle." "I noticed that in February," she said. "So did I," he said. "I kept forgetting to put it on the list." "I didn't forget," she said. I just wasn't sure if it was my list to add to. He looked at her. Something shifted in his chest that he'd stopped pretending wasn't there. It's your list, he said. It has been for a while. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she pointed to the axe entry in the catalog. The heavier one, she said, not the camp model. I know how to use it now. The heavier one, he confirmed and marked it down. They spent 2 hours in the store. They ate at the boarding house that evening, a proper meal, with other people around them, which felt strange after 6 months of their own company, the noise and proximity of strangers registering as a kind of low-grade interference. They sat across from each other and ate and talked less than usual, which was saying something, but the silence between them in a room full of other people had a different quality from the cabin's silence. It was private rather than simply quiet, a space they carried with them that the noise of the world couldn't quite reach. A man at the next table tried to strike up a conversation with Aliska about work opportunities in the camp. She answered him politely, with the particular economy of someone who was not interested in continuing the conversation, and he got the message and returned to his own meal. Bram watched this and said nothing. He was trying to recruit you, he said afterward. I know, she said. What did you think about it? She looked at him across the table. I thought that if I wanted to work in a mining camp laundry, I wouldn't have spent 6 months learning to shoot at 60 yards and service a trap line in 2 feet of snow, she said. I didn't come down the mountain to go back to what I was doing when you found me. No, he said. You came down to resupply. Yes, she said. And the corner of her mouth moved in the way it did when something was slightly funny and she wasn't going to make more of it than it was. Exactly that. They left the following morning before the camp was fully awake, which was how Bram preferred it, and which Aliska had adapted to without complaint in October and had not readapted away from in the intervening months. The horses were loaded with the winter supplies. The morning was clear and cold in the particular way of early May at elevation, the sky a hard, specific blue. At the edge of camp, where the trail began its first serious climb, Bram stopped his horse. Aliska came alongside him. He was looking up at the mountain. She looked at it too. From here the peaks were still white, the snow line still far down their flanks, the high country still fully locked in winter. The cabin was invisible from this distance, tucked into its fold in the terrain, invisible until you were 50 yards away, same as always. It'll be a full summer of work, he said, before we go back up. The east fence needs proper repair, the smokehouse needs new caulking, the north wall chinking should be redone. I know, she said. I've been making the list since March. He looked at her. You've been making a list of cabin repairs since March. Someone had to, she said. He turned his horse toward the trail. We'll camp at the granite shelf tonight, he said. Make the cabin by tomorrow afternoon. I know the way, she said. She did. He knew she did. She'd known the way since January at the latest, maybe earlier. The mountain's geography absorbed into her the same way everything else had been absorbed. By attention, by repetition, by the simple refusal to remain ignorant of anything that might become necessary. They started up. The camp fell away behind them. The noise dissolved first, then the smoke, then the specific smell of human density. What replaced it was the mountain, gradual, enormous, indifferent to what they were or what they wanted, concerned only with whether they were serious enough to be there. They were both serious enough. They had been for a long time. What Bram had thought he wanted, when he'd ridden into Harrow Gulch in October, was a pair of working hands and 6 months of not having to do everything alone. What he'd gotten was something he didn't have a clean word for. Not romance, which implied something easy, and not partnership, which was accurate but incomplete, and not family, which was a word he'd given up on years ago. What it was closer to the thing he'd found in the mountain itself at 22. Something that made sense to him in a way almost nothing else did. Something that didn't require him to be different than he was in order to function. He'd spent 41 years being himself in a world that found him difficult. He'd largely stopped apologizing for it, and largely stopped expecting it to change. And then a woman had walked into his winter with a wet wool shirt and a complete absence of tolerance for either self-pity or unnecessary risk. And she'd spent 6 months demonstrating, through the plainest possible evidence, that difficult wasn't the same as wrong. He didn't say any of this out loud. He was not built for that kind of speech, and she wasn't waiting for it. That was the thing about her. She never waited for the declaration when the fact was already visible. She read the facts. She'd been reading them all winter. The trail climbed. The horses found their rhythm. Ahead, the mountain rose into the blue May sky with the impassive authority of something that had been there long before either of them and would be there long after. And the space between Bram's horse and Aliska's was neither close nor far, but precisely what it had become over 6 months of shared survival. Comfortable, calibrated, and entirely deliberate on both sides. "Bram," she said, about a mile up. "Yeah," he said. "Next winter," she said. "I'm taking the north section of the trap line." He looked at her. "The far end," she said. "You always do it alone and it takes you 3 days and you come back half frozen every time. 2 people split it in a day and a half." He thought about it. "It's hard going on the far ridge," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been reading your notes on it since December." He faced forward again. The trail narrowed and they went single file, same as always. "All right," he said. "We'll work out the route this summer." "I already have a route," she said from behind him. He almost smiled. It was the same almost smile from February, incomplete and brief. "Of course you do," he said. She didn't answer this, which was its own kind of answer. Above them the mountain waited, patient and enormous, holding the winter in its heights, while the lower slopes came slowly back to life. The cabin was up there somewhere in its fold of terrain, dark and closed and full of the specific silence of an empty space waiting to be inhabited again. The stove cold, the partition canvas still, the supply shelves in their particular order. His logic and her refinements combined into something neither of them had designed alone. They would be there by tomorrow afternoon. They would reopen the shutters and light the stove and unpack the new supplies, and the cabin would fill again with the sounds and smells and specific gravity of 2 people who had learned each other in the hardest possible school and had not, in the end, found each other wanting. It was not a perfect life. It never had been, and it wouldn't become one. The mountain didn't offer perfection. It offered difficulty and the occasional brutal satisfaction of surviving what it threw at you. The cabin would need work all summer, and the summer would be short and the winter would come back hard, same as always. There would be arguments they hadn't had yet, and problems they couldn't anticipate, and days when the cold and the isolation pressed on them in ways that even 6 months of preparation hadn't fully covered. But the fire would hold. It had held all winter, through every hard night, through fever and injury and strangers at the tree line, and the long grinding work of survival in a place that didn't care whether you made it. It had held because one of them was always awake at 3 in the morning to feed it. That was the whole of it, really. That was the thing no one told you about building a life alongside someone. It wasn't the grand decisions that held it together. It was the 3 a.m. ones. The ones made in the dark, alone, when no one was watching and there was no particular reward for getting it right, except that the fire stayed lit and the cold stayed out, and the person on the other side of the partition could sleep through the night without knowing how close the cold had come. Aliska had made that choice every night for 6 months. So had he. They rode toward the mountain